My name is Randall Eggert. This class is Grammar and Stylistics. It's about writing clearly.
This is the second of two videos on concision. In the first video, we went over Joseph Williams' 5 principles of concision. In this one, I want to go over some other issues that I think are important. To start with, I want to distinguish between repetition and redundancy. Repetition can refer to any sort of repeating. So that can be at the level of form, grammatical form, so repeating the same syntactic structures over and over again, having the same length of sentences, anything like that, repeating words. And it can also, of course, refer to repeating information, which is specifically redundancy. So the first two don't count as redundancy. And we're really not going to be talking about them in this video, except to say that repeating words and form is going to feel a lot more problematic to a writer than to a reader. Because as you begin editing your writing, you're going to see those repetitions because you're focusing on form, whereas your readers are going to be focusing on the meaning. Now, we often talk about how terrible redundancy is, avoid redundancy. So I wanted to pull out this quote from Jerry Sadock, who was my advisor. Now, his purpose in saying this is a little different than ours, but I think what he says is important. Redundancy may be a good thing. I repeat, a good thing. What I mean by this is that there are times in a paper where it's important to repeat information. So, for example, at the beginning of a paper, you should have your thesis. At the end of the paper, you should also have your thesis. So that information is given twice. And the truth is, periodically in the body of the paper, you're probably going to refer back to that thesis or back to the problem that you introduced in the introduction. And sometimes you may feel the need to explain the same thing more than once. If it's particularly complex, you may need to explain it in different words, of course, but giving the same information in more than one way. So there you have to weigh the needs of the reader. But that's not the kind of redundancy that we're talking about when we talk about concision. So I'm going to use an extreme example. If you give your reading audience redundant information that's unnecessary and not needed, then probably your reading audience will most likely think to themselves that they are having to digest, comprehend, and understand too many words when fewer words would have more or less said approximately the exact same thing or almost the exact same thing. Atrocious. And it's easy to pare this down to, if you give your readers redundant information, then they will probably think that they are having to digest more words than necessary. So I want to talk about some special cases. The first one is expletives. Expletives are not swear words in the way that we're using it. This is a term of art referring to empty noun phrases, especially empty noun phrases that fill the subject position. So English is a language that needs to have a subject in every sentence. So every sentence needs a subject in order to be grammatical. But there are some sentences where there's no meaningful subject. I think probably the best example I can give is, it is snowing. And if somebody says that to you ever, try saying to them, what's snowing? And they'll look at you like you're crazy because there's no good answer to that. That it doesn't refer to anything. It's just a placeholder because you need a subject. In Hungarian, you don't. In Hungarian, you just need the verb. So you just say, havazik, which means snowing. And that's it. That's all you need to have a grammatical sentence in Hungarian because you don't have to have a subject. English, you do. So you throw in an it that means nothing at all. Okay, so let me give you some examples of expletive its, as in, it seems Abigail is happy. And like the snow example, you can't ask the question, what seems Abigail is happy? It has no semantic content. It's not referential. Likewise with there, as in there is an increased interest in studying coherence. Where is an increased interest in studying coherence? It's not pointing at a place as it usually does. So in these two cases, we've got words, pronouns, that usually are referential, like it can refer to just about any inanimate or even some animate objects. But in this case, it doesn't. It doesn't refer to anything. And likewise, there can refer to any place, but in this case, it doesn't refer to anything. One of the problems with expletives is they often rid sentences of good characters. They're lousy characters themselves because they're empty, and an emptiness is not a character. So, for example, in a sentence like this, until recently, it was believed that electrons, protons, and neutrons were the smallest particles of matter. Again, that it doesn't refer to anything. It's just a placeholder for the subject. But we could change that verb out of passive, was believed, to believe. And once we change it out of passive, then we get a good character in that subject position, and we get, until recently, scientists believed that electrons, protons, and neutrons were the smallest particles of matter. That's not to say that expletives are never useful. I would argue that languages don't have constructions that are useless. So there are times when expletives can serve a good purpose. So for example, take this sentence, that the majority of plagiarism is unintentional is relevant. It's a clumsy sentence. It's hard to say. The subject there is a subordinate clause. Usually we think of subjects as being noun phrases. This is an exception. It's a subordinate clause here. And here it would make a lot of sense to rearrange this sentence into something like this. It is relevant that the majority of plagiarism is unintentional. So first of all, it moves this heavy subject out of that subject position, out of the topic, and moves it to the end of the sentence. But it also takes that word unintentional, which is an important word here, more important than relevant, and puts it in the stress position, which we've talked about it in another video, and emphasizes that word unintentional. Another example, speakers need to memorize a number of rules. Now here, we've got a good subject, speakers, a good character, but imagine that what you wanted the readers to remember is the word memorize. That's your key word. That's the word that you want to ring in your readers' heads. In this case, we can revise it with their construction. There are a number of rules that speakers need to memorize. In that case, memorize now gets the stress position and will ring in a reader's head. That can be useful. So as you're revising papers, I recommend looking for these empty subjects, these expletives, and just ask yourself, is it useful? Is it serving a purpose, or did it just happen that way? Here are some examples of ones that just happen that way that serve no purpose. There are many writers who have trouble writing clearly. That's just extra verbiage. We could easily write it. Many writers have trouble writing clearly. Fewer words, easier to understand, more concise, more clear. Here's another example. It is rare that readers need to use an expletive. We could revise this to be, writers rarely need to use an expletive. Again, just punchier and more concise. So again, as you're revising, ask yourself, is it serving a purpose? Is there serving a purpose? Another sort of concision problem has to do with passives. Now, passives are constructions, they're verb constructions where we've got some form of be followed by the past participle of the verb. Passives inherently add empty words. That be is as empty as it gets. It's just a tense holder for the most part and a marker of passive. They also will sometimes rid sentences of good characters. So here are some more examples. A sense of amazement can be created in young readers by a good book. So we've got that passive construction, be created. So we've got the be followed by the past participle of create. And in this case, we also have this word by, which is again added because of the passive. We also have a nominalization, which is also lending to adding more words and lack of concision, lack of clarity, all sorts of other things. So let's revise all of that, and we get a good book can amaze young readers. And I think we can all agree that's a much better sentence. Here's another example. How passives affect readers is discussed in this paper. In this paper, we discuss how passives affect readers. Again, I think we can all agree this is just a better sentence. That doesn't mean you should always avoid passives. Now, I was told this when I was young and when I was first writing, avoid passives. It's terrible advice. Passives are useful. There's a good reason why we have passives in the language. Passives can be useful when they move a long, complex phrase out of the subject position into the predicate. So, for example, the woman who lives across the street from my brother ran over my bicycle. All right, so that's a sentence with a subject that is, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 words long. Anything over about 5 words in the subject position is going to put a strain on the reader's short-term memory. So if we use a passive here, we can get, my bicycle was run over by the woman who lives across the street from my brother. This is going to make it easier on your readers to process. Situations like this call for passives. Another case would be when the agent of the sentence is irrelevant, when we don't care who did the action, just that the action happened. So science experiments. When describing science experiments, it's very common to use passives because the scientists are irrelevant, right? One of the primary principles of science is that if an experiment is done properly, it shouldn't matter who conducted it. And so you want to background the experimenters and foreground the experiment. So let me give you an example of that. This actually comes from my brother's research. He's a physicist working at Lawrence Livermore Labs. A team of technicians aimed the NIF laser system at the diamond in order to subject it to immense heat. Now, the truth is these technicians do a highly important job, but they're not essential for the experiment in the sense that any experienced technicians could have done it. It didn't matter which team did it. And so in this case, it would be better to phrase it, the NIF laser system was aimed at the diamond in order to subject it to immense heat. And here it's more concise, it's briefer, but it's also more to the point. Again, you've introduced a character in the first one that wasn't necessary for the story being told. The story is more about the diamond and the NIF laser system. Okay, another case is where passives can be useful for cohesion and emphasis. So, for example, good readers demand evidence, only credible research will persuade them. It's not terrible, but it seems that we might as well keep those readers as our topic and get the credible research there at the end of the sentence as our stress. So in that case, we would get good readers demand evidence. They will only be persuaded by credible research. I want to end with a final example. This was a sentence that was written to the parents of elementary school students. It seems as though it isn't always being communicated to students that they need to take the story test that goes along with the longer stories we read. And I want to focus on that. It seems as though it isn't always being communicated. There, we actually have 2 expletive its. It seems and it isn't always being communicated. So we've got that passive being communicated, which I understand the motive there. The teacher wanted to background himself. He didn't want to take responsibility for the lack of communicating. right? Similarly, politicians do this. Famously, Ronald Reagan said of his own administrations, mistakes were made. Rather than owning up to the mistakes and saying, we made mistakes, he chose to say mistakes were made. And that's a common complaint about passives, is that it's sometimes used to dodge responsibility. Well, we could revise this quite easily to make it clearer and to avoid that avoiding of responsibility. Apparently, which is another way of saying it seems as though, apparently, I haven't always communicated to the students that they need to take the story test that goes along with the longer stories we read. Much better sentence, much clearer, and much more responsible.